This was the quietest crisis in ancient history, and the one that broke more empires than foreign invasions ever did. Not tactics, not bravery, not even great generals. Money, or more precisely, the system that kept weapons in loyal hands. Empires didn't unravel because they lost wars. They unraveled because sustaining their armies became impossible. When compensation stopped feeling fair, allegiance dissolved faster than any oath ever could. Welcome to the Wealth Casebook, where money, power, and history intersect, and nothing operates as simply as it appears. Long before banks, income taxes, central authorities, or public debt, every empire confronted the same ruthless question: how do you keep vast armies fed, supplied, and obedient year after year? Soldiers do not fight on ideals alone. They fight for guarantees safety for their families, honor, land, or tangible payment. And once armies ceased to be seasonal militias and transformed into permanent institutions, war stopped being a battlefield problem and became an accounting one that reshaped entire civilizations. Ancient states operated under constraints that modern governments rarely face. They could not create money on demand. They could not finance permanent deficits. When the treasury emptied, there was no institution designed to rescue it. No emergency liquidity. No external backstop. Military power therefore had to be anchored to something tangible and enforceable: metal extracted from the ground, land seized through conquest, or labor compelled from subject populations. These arrangements were not theoretical. They structured entire societies, determining who produced value, who absorbed risk, and who suffered when the system tightened. Few empires demonstrated this reality more clearly than Rome. At its peak, the Roman Empire supported an army approaching 400,000 soldiers deployed across multiple continents. This was not a temporary levy assembled for a single campaign. It was a permanent organization with expectations baked into its structure. Soldiers anticipated regular wages, defined service terms, and retirement compensation that often included land grants. These benefits were not gifts. They were the operating expense of imperial stability. Roman frontiers held not because of abstract loyalty, but because payment was predictable, enforceable, and initially credible. That credibility rested on silver. The Roman state did not pay its army with promises or accounting entries. It paid with metal. The denarius became the core instrument of imperial administration. Soldiers earned it. Merchants accepted it. Taxes were assessed and collected through it. Roman authority itself was physically impressed onto each coin, turning currency into a portable symbol of power. As long as the denarius retained its value, the system functioned with remarkable efficiency. Silver, however, imposed its own discipline. It had to be mined, refined, and transported. Its availability was finite. Rome's strategic priorities increasingly reflected this reality. Expansion was not driven solely by defense or prestige, but by access to resources capable of sustaining payrolls. The conquest of Hispania offered more than territorial security. It provided access to some of the most productive silver mines in the known world. Those mines did not merely enrich elites. They underwrote the wages of legions. Rome quite literally excavated its military power. For a time, the loop reinforced itself. Soldiers trusted their compensation. Traders relied on Roman currency. Taxes circulated efficiently back to the state. The army enforced order, protected commerce, and ensured continued extraction of silver. Money, force, and administration operated as a closed system, but physical resources impose limits that institutions cannot negotiate away. Over time, Rome encountered them. By the 2nd century, accessible silver deposits were depleted. Mining costs rose sharply. Military operations became more expensive as borders stretched farther from the center. Revenue growth failed to keep pace with obligations. Confronted with this imbalance, Roman authorities avoided structural reform and instead adopted a subtler response. The currency was altered. The denarius retained its appearance. Its imagery remained authoritative, but its composition changed. Silver content was gradually reduced and replaced with base metals. The adjustment was incremental and politically convenient. On official ledgers, wages remained unchanged. In practice, purchasing power declined. Initially, the effects were muted. Prices adjusted slowly. Confidence lingered, but the underlying imbalance persisted. As debasement continued, market behavior shifted. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Soldiers found that their pay no longer covered basic needs. The state responded by increasing nominal wages, funded by further debate. Prices rose again. Taxes followed. The burden fell most heavily on those without bargaining power: farmers, laborers, and urban households whose incomes were fixed. Inflation did not arrive as a single rupture. It accumulated through small, rational decisions that collectively weakened the system. The military adapted faster than civilian society. Soldiers began to expect bonuses and extraordinary payments. Emperors unable to meet these demands lost legitimacy and, often, their lives. Loyalty migrated from institutions to individuals who controlled fiscal resources. Military power ceased to serve the state. The state increasingly existed to satisfy its military. The broader population absorbed the cost. Savings eroded. Trade became volatile. Confidence in currency declined. What began as a technical adjustment to resource scarcity evolved into a prolonged transfer of wealth from civilians to the armed apparatus. Rome's failure was not an abandonment of silver, but an over-reliance on it. When supply constraints tightened, the illusion of stability collapsed. By the 3rd century, the denarius contained little silver at all. Soldiers were compensated through rations, supplies, and land allocations. Monetary exchange fragmented, regional economies disconnected. Trust dissolved. An empire once unified through standardized currency found itself weighed down by the mechanics of sustaining its own army. This transition marked more than an economic adjustment. It signaled a change in how power was negotiated. When money failed, force reasserted itself as compensation. Land, privilege, and future promises replaced reliable pay. Expansion became a substitute for solvency, not a strategy of choice, but of necessity. Rome's experience exposed a pattern that would reappear elsewhere. When a state can no longer sustain its army through stable systems of exchange, it mortgages its future to short-term control. The consequences are delayed, uneven, and often misunderstood, but they are rarely avoided. That lesson would be learned again by empires that believed expansion itself could permanently replace payment obligations. Long before Rome confronted the limits of monetary payment, other empires had already built military systems that assumed expansion would substitute for wages. The Assyrian Empire offers one of the earliest and most explicit examples. Its army was feared not only for tactical effectiveness, but for the economic logic that sustained it. Assyrian soldiers were not compensated primarily through salaries. They were rewarded through conquest itself. Successful campaigns delivered plunder, captives, and land. Cities that resisted were not merely subdued, they were dismantled. Their populations deported and reorganized to support future wars. This was not uncontrolled brutality. It was deliberate design. The Assyrian state avoided the complexity of a monetary payroll by allowing war to finance itself. Each victory replenished resources, reinforced loyalty, and amplified the terror that reduced resistance in subsequent campaigns. Violence was not a byproduct of the system. It was the mechanism that kept it solvent. But this structure contained an inherent fragility. When expansion slowed, rewards disappeared. Soldiers, accustomed to compensation through victory, had no tolerance for restraint. Once conquest ceased to deliver material returns, cohesion collapsed. Rebellion, fragmentation, and internal conflict followed quickly. A related but more administratively refined model emerged centuries later in the early Islamic caliph. Here, soldiers were paid through state stipends, funded by taxes imposed on conquered territories. Land taxes, commercial levies, and religiously defined obligations flowed toward the center and were redistributed to the military elite. As long as territorial growth continued, revenue expanded alongside it. Loyalty remained intact, but when borders stabilized and conquest slowed, the system strained. Administrative costs increased, tax burdens intensified, political unity, once masked by expansion, fractured under fiscal pressure. Growth was not optional. It was structural. Elsewhere, states pursued solutions that relied less on money and more on organization. In Han Dynasty China, the government maintained large standing armies without exclusive dependence on coinage. Instead, it mobilized society directly. Taxes were collected in multiple forms: grain, textiles, and labor. Peasants were obligated to perform periods of forced work, constructing infrastructure, maintaining supply lines, and supporting logistics. Soldiers were provisioned from centralized granaries. Campaigns were planned around transport capacity rather than treasury reserves. The system was efficient and resilient, but it imposed constant demands on the population. Entire communities lived under permanent obligation to support military operations they would never witness. It functioned only as long as administrative authority remained strong. When enforcement weakened, the structure unraveled with the same inevitability seen elsewhere. Some empires removed money from the equation almost entirely. The Aztec Empire did not maintain a salaried standing army in the modern sense. Warriors fought for status, prestige, and the right to extract tribute. Conquered cities were compelled to deliver food, materials, textiles, and captives on fixed schedules. These flows sustained the capital and rewarded the military class that enforced compliance. The system was bureaucratic and meticulously recorded. Campaigns prioritized fear and submission over territorial expansion. The army functioned simultaneously as enforcer and tax collector. But the structure was brittle. When tribute flows were disrupted, collapse followed rapidly. There was no buffer, no surplus mechanism, and no capacity to adapt. Across civilizations, the tools differed. The principle did not. Armies are never paid in abstraction. They are compensated with tangible resources: metal, land, labor, or lives. Whatever form that payment takes shapes the society beneath it. It determines who produces, who sacrifices, and who bears the risk when systems strain. Modern states often assume this problem has been solved. Today, armies are funded through budgets, bonds, and accounting frameworks. Salaries arrive electronically. Equipment is financed through long-term contracts. Wars are sustained through deficits rather than plunder. Yet beneath the terminology, the structure remains familiar. Military spending is treated as non-negotiable. When fiscal pressure mounts, social programs are debated. Defense allocations are protected. Inflation shifts the cost of that protection onto the population. Debt replaces tribute. Central banks replace mines. The burden still falls on those farthest from decision-making power. Inflation today performs the same function coin debasement once did. It allows states to meet obligations without explicit taxation. It redistributes purchasing power away from savers and wage earners. It shields those closest to money creation. The instruments have changed. The incentives have not. Empires do not fail because they lose battles. They fail because the systems that pay for force become unsustainable. Collapse rarely arrives as a single event. It unfolds as erosion first trust, then stability, then cohesion. Understanding how armies are paid is not academic curiosity. It is a map of power. And when that map begins to distort, history shows that the destination is rarely in doubt. Because if you never learn how wealth moves through authority, if you miss who is protected when pressure hits systems, and if you mistake inflation, leverage, and extraction for accidents, then the past won't loop back. It will keep advancing, and you'll absorb the outcomes without ever spotting the source. If this shifted how you see things, tap subscribe. History explains the pattern. I'll help you find it right now from history.